All right. I went for most of this conference thinking that final thoughts meant my final thoughts about this. So I was very dutiful in listening to what everyone says. And I thought I wouldn't have listened anyways. And trying to figure out to come up with some sort of wonderful summation of all that we've done here. And then last night at dinner, Roland told me, oh, no, you don't have to do that. So as it turns out, I don't have any final thoughts. But I'm here to.
Like we'll have to work.
Yes, it's now you have to work. But no, I have it, and I want to thank everyone for coming. When Roland and I first talked about doing this conference in Symbolism, I thought it was a great idea. Yay! Hey. And it helped me. I knew it was going to be helpful for me in terms of some of the things I was working on, and it would be great to have such a narrow focus, the symbolism theme, as a topic for the conference in Whitehead. Everyone would be on the same page in terms of the issue problems they're addressing. But despite that sort of narrow mandate, we had a very wide variety of papers and topics and approaches to that, which was wonderful. So I want to thank everyone for coming and doing such a good job. I want to thank Roland for the usual support that he's offered, and Joe and everyone else for all the work that they did. I want to thank you all for that. Joe's the real machine behind all this that you see here. The other thing I've noticed during the talks is that because we had 30 minutes and everyone used almost every minute of those 30 minutes, we often had to cut questions short. And so what I want to do now, as long as there is time, and I'm just here to moderate, is this is time for anyone who has any questions or wants to continue a conversation that you felt may have been cut short by any of the speakers or any of the speakers amongst one another. It's sort of a free-for-all. I guess I'm moderating just if it gets out of hand or anything like that. Becomes a rumble in the middle or something like that. Then I'll come in and stop things. But otherwise, does anyone have any questions of anyone or any Yes.
Yeah. So I noticed what might be a possible tension, just contrasting Adam's talk with the wonderful panel that we just enjoyed, 20 minutes ago, which is this idea of slowing down so as to allow entry by other voices into our discourses. But also, I mean, and this seems like a really kind of worthwhile measure to take.
Okay.
But on the other hand, there is a definite urgency that hangs over our discourses regarding issues of science and technology and the effects that we have upon the more than human world. So I was just wondering if you guys wanted to kind of interrogate how it's possible to mediate between this need to include as many voices as possible while still maybe paying due deference to the need for action and perhaps rapid action on behalf of the planet and the more than human world.
No, I think that's really smart. I was actually just talking to Michael a second ago about sort of this question actually, in some version of it, or at least, because it seems to me that especially with the work on climate change, it often makes you think of like what is to be done, right? And that there's this what is to be done discourse, and it often sort of tips into this idea of the climate crisis, right? That there is a crisis in some way, right? That there is a world we hold in common or something like this, and it would, it's in danger. At least life as we know it, or something like that. I think one of the risks, though, of any sort of critical urgency is that it might tip into crisis, and this is precisely what capitalism feeds on, the crisis discourse, right? So, for me, I think I wonder, and I think you're absolutely right to point this out, right? That there needs to be a way to mediate this idea that we have to think about what is to be done without thinking about it in terms of crisis, or we need a new way of addressing the problem. I don't know, maybe Catherine.
It's a great question. And I appreciate the initial response. Right. I mean, I think it's true. Capitalism feeds on a sense of crisis by encouraging us to, A, deny it, and B, kind of enjoy it, profit from it,
absolutely.
or greenwash it if need be. No, but basically eat, drink, and be merry. I think it's profoundly reinforcing that kind of cataclysmic denial. So, but you're right, but just to live in a constant state of crisis doesn't get us anywhere. I wrote a book way back in the last millennium called Apocalypse Now and Then, which wasn't really thinking very much yet about climate. It was a little more preoccupied with the nuclear crisis, though that had shifted by the time I actually wrote the book. But I was meditating on an apocalypse pattern in our civilization that sets up a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of doom and then of a very authoritarian answers to that doom. And I saw it on the left as well as the right.
Yeah, sure.
And I saw it in myself and in my particular kind of radical feminism, as well as in the fundamentalist right with their version of John of Patmos. And now I think I'm going to write a little booklet called Apocalypse After All, question mark, and just reconsider those symbolic narratives. Because after all, it's just John of Patmos wasn't wrong. Actually, it's just a little eerie how well he predicts the way in which something like what we now mean by global capitalism, which he signified as the whore of Babylon, with very precise, complex economic symbolism wrapped into it, was entangled in bringing down most of the livable earth. But even if I go back to that text again, part of the point will be to say, and there is in it no end of the world. That's not a biblical phrase. It's not a concept. There's just great collapse of systems, and then there's a kind of urban renewal and big sort of city park of the New Jerusalem. But we were talking about this a little bit yesterday in terms of speed. What you're saying about slow science seems very important, and we need slow theology, we need slow philosophy. Philosophers already know that, probably more than scientists or theologians. Slow art. And yet it's a slowing down that seems to allow us to rhythmically entrain ourselves with forms of entanglement that are happening at perhaps infinite speed.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of propose a slogan, which is always inadequate, really. But so in France in May 1968, when there was this big rebellion, one of these slogans was, "Be realistic, demand the impossible." Now, but an acquaintance of mine in the UK, Anindya Bhattacharya, I had to look anyway, Anindya Bhattacharya proposed, this is like 8 or 9 years ago, that perhaps we need to reverse the slogan today. He observed there are a lot of things which actually are within the realm of, he didn't use this phrase, but in the Whiteheadian sense, real potentiality, which yet nonetheless, if you ask politicians about it, they'll say, oh, that's not realistic. It's not realistic to give people a living wage. It's not because it'll, mess with the market. It's not realistic. So he suggested that the slogan we really need is, be unrealistic, demand the possible. I've been incredibly taken with this phrase. And I think it's, it's meaningful in the sense that there's a gap between, there's always, utopianism is always criticized for, having castles in the sky and saying something and how it could ever get here from there. But in fact, there are things which we are socially and technologically capable of, but which, again, are outside of any political discourse. Both Labour as well as the Conservatives in the UK and both Democrats as well as the Republicans in the US will say, no, it's impossible, we can't possibly do that, and it's not realistic. But the point is that it actually is possible, or actually is part of real potentiality, even though it's outside of the radar of what you're allowed to talk about. So
it might be unlikely. It doesn't mean it's impossible.
Right. Again, it is real potentiality. The future is open, and so there are things which could be done, and we have to realize the reason that they seem impossible is because of power arrangements rather than because that we couldn't actually do it.
To talk about the UK, Scotland recently had a vote as to whether it should go independent, nearly did. The outcome of that is they've given more tax-raising powers, etc., to Scotland. Now, what people are beginning to realise is that within the higher education system in England, tuition fees are, okay, they might sound cheap, but they're £9,000 a year. In Scotland, it's free. Now, so we're living in a country whereby if you're Scottish and you go to a Scottish university, you get a free education. Now, this seems possible. So this is what we need to suggest to our students is, Scotland's meant to be the poorer bit. That's why it couldn't go independent, because it wasn't economically sustainable for it. So we think of, England as being the rich bit with London, a great global city. And yet it is possible within the UK, if you're Scottish, to get free higher education. Why is it not possible in London?
Because it's unrealistic.
But that's exactly if you say to the politician, or the vice chancellors, whatever, and they go, no, it's impossible. It's unrealistic. You're asking for, you're trying to turn back time. That was, the 1960s. No, because time in Scotland, it's still it's there.
Let me throw out a question, maybe get some more conversation going. When I guess it's my privilege as moderator, I can do that. I noticed, maybe it's because I taught it this summer, I taught Dewey's The Public and Its Problems, and which was written around the exact same time that Whitehead gave these lectures, the late 20s. And one of the things that Dewey talks about is the rise of news technology, mass information, and so on, and sensationalism in the news. And one of the things he complained about that is that a news phenomenon comes up like the Ebola crisis. It's all Ebola all the time, 24 hours a day, and then it's gone. And then so there's this phenomena where a news phenomena is detached from the historical roots and context in which it became possible. And so that screams causal efficacy. And Dewey was concerned about rising technology as he saw it in the late 20s, making it harder and harder for us to really look at the historical causal efficacy of the situation we're in, and we needed to change things. And I know this seems to be a topic that's coming up, and especially the last talk, but I'm not feeling more hopeful at the end of this conference than I was at the beginning. Not that this was a palliative to make me feel better, but anyone else share the similar feelings, or anyone in the audience about any takeaways? Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I tried to engage Luke in a discussion about when he was talking about crafting symbolic reference. And one of the things that I think is very important to recognize is that there are these systems of symbolic reference that are already there and working. And there's an issue of adjudicating between systems that are well founded, at least in operation. They have harnessed causal efficacy in their behalf very effectively. And the rhetorical issues that have sort of come up today more than before are raising in my mind the question, well, do we repudiate something, or do we supplement what's there? I mean, it's always a decision that a controversialist, a professional controversialist has to figure out. What are we going to do? Are we going to display an alternative and, through its power of attraction, persuade others, or are we going to beat down the walls and overrun the other side's position? I don't see a lot of controversialist advice in Whitehead's work. He's not that. I also understand that although he was wonderful and personable and friendly and so forth, he didn't. His principal means of expression in class was as a lecturer. He didn't go in for a whole lot of discussion in class, at least if I can't remember the woman's name now.
Emmett? Dorothy
Yeah,
Emmett?
Dorothy Emmett. So I don't really look to him for a trial practice seminar. But and certainly in short-term controversies such as I'm in, you make it up as you go, depending on what the other side is doing and so forth. But I think it's very important to be able to portray the historical root, to use another Whiteheadian term, for how we got to where we are. One of the things that rarely comes up, and it only comes up, the symbolic reference system that is working in support of global capitalism is portraying itself as a natural phenomenon, not as explicit policy. And they're getting away with it. And that seems to me, though, I feel kind of instinctively that there's an opening there. Some villains need to be hung out to dry. But I
mean,
I think
being a
that's a whole-
controversialist, I don't think global capitalism exists.
is what?
I don't think global capitalism exists. I think it's the wrong way of thinking about it. What always strikes me when I come to America is quite how socialist a country it is, without it noticing. I mean, I'm from the UK, as I don't know if you know about football and the Premier League,
Yeah.
where it's money, money, money. But you have the draft in the NF, in American football. We think it's absolutely amazing. So whoever did worse this year gets the first pick, but next year of the best player. This is just, it's socialism in operation. I mean, it's utter madness.
That's syndicalism. I mean, that's,
Okay. I mean, it's syndicate, but it's not. It's strange because I'm here. I come around and I look at all the extent to which I don't want to say it's government, but the number of rules that you have, which we don't have in the UK. Crossing the road, for example. I'm always amazed that everybody talks about the right to bear arms, and nobody talks about the right to cross the road and make an adult decision as to there's no traffic. I don't have to wait for the wait sign. I don't have to, I can just pass it over. It's incredible. And now this is part of. But by saying there is such a thing as global capitalism, we've already given up on the argument and said, and now we have to defeat it. Whereas actually, it hasn't permeated all aspects of our feelings and our lives, And
I'm inclined to quote Warren Ellis, who's a British comic book writer. His comment on America was, if I go into a bar in Tennessee carrying a loaded shotgun, no problem. But if I go to a bar in Tennessee and light up a cigarette, I'm really in big trouble. So,
I mean, Jeff, to get back to your point, it depends what the problem is. But you're worried about, but you haven't had your palliative care for. I mean, it's.
Yes.
What are you actually worried about? If you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I guess that's the issue, and I think that's one of the things you were bringing up is, and I think Adam brought it up in his talk as well, that the idiot, right? Part of the idiot is being able to raise a problem or a question, and if you, in certain forms of speech, and this becomes very Foucaultian, certain forms of discourse or questions or problems are refused from the get-go, and so you would be an idiot to even raise them. So I think that was an important point. So I think we're in search of a problem with which we can gain some traction, and I think we can't do it without that affect either. I think that's certainly.
Affect alien might be cousin to the idiot.
Yeah.
I mean, to respond to your question, I'll
Yeah.
shut up in a minute if you want, Roland. Just wave at me if you want me to shut up. To respond to your question about
Walk
affect.
over, you know.
Sorry?
I'll walk over.
No, I didn't. With respect to people who work in affect, and I see why they use it, I just don't use the term, and I refuse to engage. I set myself a task: never say discursive, never say affect, and see if you can get your point across. That's a task I set myself,
Well,
because I agree with you.
Making
that
rules
it's-
like that is always admirable because it allows you to actually, it helps to channel novelty, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm fine.
Sounds ideological to me.
Yeah. It's just, I worry that sometimes by saying affect and effective, we're sort of like just saying, and we know what that means, and
Yeah.
and,
No,
and,
there's-
we
well-
sort of- and we don't.
Yeah.
No, of course, there's always a problem. I mean,
Yeah.
there's always a problem with once any kind of discursive system or any kind, say I use another bad word, but any kind of system of thought or any kind of approach becomes too popular, it gets worn down and it becomes used in formulaic and uncreative ways. And I mean, I've certainly felt that with many other, forms of theory or whatever that I get engaged in. So I'm sometimes worried, what if Whitehead becomes too popular? Then everybody will talk about causal efficacy and it'll get worn down by, I mean, I don't want to adopt this because it's a little bit like somebody. It's a little bit like somebody saying, "Oh, I was into those bands 3 years ago, but now that everybody likes them, I think they suck." I mean, I don't really want to get caught in that. But at the same time, I do worry about certain, catchphrases, certain even frameworks when they propagate too much, they become so overused that then you start groaning, saying, "Oh, that's not what I really wanted to see happen when I was using those phrases or adopting those ideas."
Yeah, love, justice, God, democracy. Cliche-ridden universe of terms we better not do without.
Yeah. No, it's an insoluble problem.
So Deleuze was talking not only about infinite speed, right, but he meant something localized with it. He was talking about the body without organs, and it's less. I mean, people refer to it in the later part of that writing, but the earlier one, and Capitalism and Schizophrenia, when he talks about the capital, he talks also about the body without organs.
Mm-hmm.
And he differentiates between a full body without organs and an empty body. And it's interesting that, so the empty body is the body that actually, it's almost like a presentational immediacy that lets the community of things come about. And the full body is that closes it down, so that it sucks all life out of it, and that's capital for him. Capital is a full body without organs. Mm-hmm. And it's so smart, and almost its nature, it's more and less than ideology, it is nature, and it's God, as you say yesterday, it's kind of the notion of God here, because it's so fluent, because it's so pervasive, not because it stops us, because it suppresses, it kind of is in the middle of everything, so you can't catch it, but it's still kind of taking everything into its own account. And so, I wonder whether at a certain point it could be even the case that it's not about greater fluency sometimes, but it's like, and going back to slowness, it's of certain stoppages that would come in with Whitehead's multifariousness, where there's a certain disconnect that actually furthers this kind of multiplicity by which we are not able to be pervaded by these kind of forces in the same way as the capital for Deleuze early on did or does. Well, I don't know.
No,
That's
well, I mean, I entirely agree with you. I'm on record in print as taking seriously, the relation between Whitehead's God and Deleuze and Guattari's body without organs, and it's something that's crucial to every. I mean, though the body without organs of capital is a bad God rather than Whitehead's God, which, however dark it may be, as in Stephen's suggestion yesterday, is. But it's like so it's a negative image of it. But I mean, I think something which is in the middle of everything and which attributes everything to itself without actually being the cause of everything, though it's necessary to the functioning of everything. I don't know. I think I find entertaining that sort of proposition to be powerful and important. I don't know if that.
I think just to throw out one more point, and this reminded me of something you said about, was it Jimmy Hoffa who got it for taxes, and how Deleuze famously said in What is Philosophy that he avoids conversations. And whenever a philosopher says, let's discuss this, he runs in the opposite direction. And the reason for that is that, as he puts it, conversations either always come too early or too late. That once a problem gets to the point where it can be put into the sort of common discourse of conversation, it's missed what was problematic about it. And so problems are always unique and singular and can't really be captured by the sort of the commonalities of discourse. But they're also surprising, and I think that's the sense in which a number of people have been talking about whatever Whitehead's good for is he's embraces and wants us to be aware of the surprises of novelty and open to those surprises. And if you were able to make up a plan in conversation, that's probably not going to be where it happens.
This was our conversation. Too late, too early.
Or will something surprising happen we weren't planning?
Yeah. No, I'm just adding to what you said, Jeff. But yeah, I mean, Deleuze's aversion to conversation is an aversion to the way in which it forms a normalizing or policing function. So, I mean, he's opposing conversation as if we all discuss this together, we'll come to a consensus, which will then make it impossible to go off on speculative flights anymore. As opposed to the way in which, when you do go off on speculative flights, and you introduce or you apprehend novelty, or you have develop propositions which really create new possibilities. I mean, that's obviously Whitehead's language, not Deleuze's, but I think what Deleuze talked about. That always involves contact. I mean, it's not solipsistic. It involves contact between different things, but there's certain types of contact, which is what he means by conversation, which have precisely the function of wearing away those leaps into novelty.
This is one of the points of presentational immediacy in the book, when it says things have relevance to one another but are independent. And to recognize that is precisely where novelty comes in. So I was kind of, I'm not hopeful that concerted action and coming to a solution that we can subscribe to is in fact a Whiteheadian, I don't know, thrust, right? To go. I see that as more the full body without organs just turned around into another direction. So I wonder where the novelty is precisely coming in through accepting that there is a disconnection that happens in non-concerted but contemporary or simultaneous way.
But isn't that a fruitful line of thinking, just because that kind of disconnection might allow new forms of assemblage, new forms of connection?
Not as overpowering.
Well,
pattern.
I had to look in Inventor's Ideas because I didn't want to misquote one of my favorite passages, but it's when the vast causal independence of contemporary occasions is the preservative of the elbow room within the universe. It provides each actuality with a welcome environment for irresponsibility. Am I my brother's keeper expresses one of the earliest gestures of self-consciousness. So, I mean, that side has to be kept into account. We also talk about community and consensus and, mobilizing people together, but I think we need that Whitehead writes, we need that irresponsibility as well.
Yes.
So maybe Whitehead in Max Weber's famous analysis of charisma is like the fascination with the charisma, the novel idea, the irresponsibility, the boyishness, because the juvenile is often the irresponsible boy, by gender moment here. But as soon as you get to what Weber calls the routinization of charisma, Whitehead loses interest. Is that, and that kind of resonates with that role in what I thought you were saying.
It's also, this makes me think of that fantastic quote that Stephen drew us to, is like, And this sort of comes back to this question that I asked, I think, in the beginning, what I call the annoying question is like, what is the political, right? And it seems to me that, Timothy Campbell, he's at Cornell, and he's doing some really interesting work on, we call it the impolitical. And it seems to me that the question of the political has always been taken up in terms of a set of solutions, right? That we address this in terms of a set of solutions that are sort of, that do away with the mess, that do away with the conflict, right? Where the impolitical is something that is precisely what doesn't arrive at a solution. So I mean, I'm just thinking about a new terrain for addressing the question of the political in Whitehead's work, and maybe it's in terms of the impolitical that we need to be thinking.
I want to mention that I quoted that passage in my paper. No, what I want to say is really, so there is this, I'm fascinated by it, this meeting between Charles Lindbergh and Whitehead. And where they talked about the future of civilization in the next 300 years. or 150 years, whatever. And what Whitehead comes up in this discussion with, what makes him kind of hopeful, or the condition for that is that gentleness would prevail. Which is, right, he's not conflictual in this sense. And it reminds me that, I mean, I'm thinking of gentleness not to be refusing conflicts, but to see conflicts in this field of relevance but independence. If that is, the more that is accepted, the less it will be violent, I guess, in this sense. And last point on that, I think that reminds me, without quoting quoting the whole quote, when he says that it's about, I think gentleness could be about this power that is in the absence of force and has a decisiveness, as he says, of a supreme ideal, which is not necessarily idealism or ideology, as we know in Whitehead. And this is why, if this happens, the world divides at this point. The history of the world divides at this point, wherever this event happens. Now, he is referring to Jesus Christ here at this point, but it doesn't matter. There are events, right, in which that can happen.
Roland, I'll just add to that. I mean, I think what you're saying and talking about gentleness resonates very well with one of the phrases from Whitehead that Isabel Stengers is always emphasizing, which is turning oppositions into contrasts, which Stengers links with the necessity for diplomacy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the peacemaking propositions.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a good point. Yeah.
But doesn't that beg for a Whitehead who's interested in more than the revolutionary moment, the novelty? I mean, what we all love about Marx are the early essays, and Marxism is embarrassing, and we'd rather not talk about it. Right? Is it so? And yet, especially as Stephen just parsed it, that is it's a sort of project for a mature politics, for a Swede and not a North American.
Well, I mean, that's fine by me. I don't love conflict I'm scared of it. The problem for me, and this is a problem which I have with Stengers' formation of something, is what do we do when we're confronted with the Koch brothers who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars in order to actively make the world much worse, a much worse place? I mean, I don't have an answer, but,
I will disagree with this equation of Whitehead as being interested in the revolutionary moments, as that's what novelty means. It seems to me that novelty is in some circumstances associated with revolution, but it is by no means, the revolution is not at the heart of novelty. And where that is because when Stenger says focuses on his language of turning oppositions into contrast, that's of course the function of creativity in the large sense, and it is not revolutionary. It's evolutionary, if it's anything. So I think that has to be brought to bear on these moments of crisis where it seems that only revolution, the only possibility is revolution, and then that's all I'll say. It's important not to quickly run and say it's revolution. He's a revolutionary, because I don't think that's what most of our sense of his.
And the passage about Virginia.
He aspires to is in fact.
And that's supported by any understanding of a consequent nature, which builds something harmonious over time. It's supported by all the uses of the term harmony, especially in later Whitehead, and aesthetics. I mean, an aesthetic that doesn't work with forms, with creative use of existing forms, isn't a full aesthetic.
Yeah. And the revolutionary, there's the passage we talked about Virginia, right?
Yeah.
The life in Virginia stayed the same, and so the revolution didn't destroy.
And of course, that's why the Civil War had to take place, because
Yeah.
Virginia stayed too much the same.
And to do Deleuze and Guattari again in Anti-Oedipus, they talk about schizoanalysis, where there's a little bit of schizophrenia in art, but what you need to do is you need to kind of become a little dabble in schizophrenia without becoming schizophrenic. And so you dabble in the revolution without it being destructive, and it has that tendency to do that. And
We don't want to mute those three revolutions,
No,
right? And I don't think
no.
you're saying that, but understand that revolutionary outburst of force can also happen at multiple scales, temporalities, and optimally is a transmutation of incompatibility into complexity, into richness of contrast. I mean, here, just since I'm in a Connolly kick, I find his distinction between agonism and antagonism helpful. I mean, I'm so prone to want to embrace a kind of nice feminist nonviolence, and I'm just trying to train myself to be more open to the forms of militancy that are I think, crucial to making a difference, but that don't necessarily commit us, to a Marxist nostalgia for getting out our guns. But that do suggest that even nonviolence, of course, invites violence, as it did with Martin Luther King's movement, with Gandhi's movement. It's just that there's a moral privilege placed upon those who invite the violence but take it upon themselves. But these nonviolent movements provoked tremendous agonism and also brought out antagonistic forces of violence, but then stood there receiving the effects of that violence, taking them transformatively into themselves, so that indeed contrast emerged. But obviously no one has any patience with Whitehead, who doesn't want to embed revolution in an evolutionary process, but really radically speed up our evolution and therefore our strategies for nonviolent transformation, so that they become truly active and militant.
I just have
And beautiful.
a slightly absurd thought. Talking about the three revolutions, but Whitehead then doesn't mention the Russian Revolution. I wonder what he would have said about the Mao and the Cultural Revolution.
I don't think he would have liked this the way Badiou does.
I mean, the reason I'm thinking that is that there was a writer in the UK who had a big argument. She was at my university, wrote a big public letter where she accuses the management of the modern university as being like the Chinese Communist Party, in terms of managerialism.
Mark Fisher has called that market Stalinism.
Yeah,
It's the same thing.
what I'm trying to think of is actually the Maoist Cultural Revolution as an example of a revolution, which is exactly not novelty, and it's actually forming, so in the 20th century what we have as an outcome is actually a form of conformity with unnovelty. So when Mao said, asked about the French Revolution,
It was actually Zhou Enlai, but Zhou Enlai.
Oh, was it? Okay.
But
do you want to do that one? Go on.
Well,
I'll set you up. It's great.
No, you said it. It's actually a mistake. It's actually apparently, but the story was that Zhou Enlai, the number 2 person in Chinese government, was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he said, it's still too early to tell. But apparently, I've read since that actually he was being asked about the 1968 uprising in France, not about the 18th century French Revolution, which is disappointing because it doesn't make it quite as long-term as...
No, not at all. Well, I see it's noon and I see lunch is here, so I want to thank everyone again for attending. And I also want to let you know that the Center for Process Studies has books for sale. It's across the parking lot, so feel free if anyone is over there, interested to stop by on your way out. But and we can perhaps continue the conversation at lunch. But thanks again
Gives
for
ourselves
attending.
a hand.